Hello, welcome to HLA Live. HLA Live is our regular broadcast on the HLA YouTube channel as well as all the other social media channels. Each week we talk to interesting people from across the HLA community to share with us their ideas and their innovations and hopefully bring them to a global audience. Many of the topics come from our community, with scholars and faculty expressing an interest in many of the discussions that we're about to have. HLA programs are built on 6 pillars. The leader is an innovator and entrepreneur, the leader is a communicator, the leader is a manager, the leader as a negotiator, the leader as a follower, and the leader as a philosopher. If you are interested in becoming a HLA scholar, why not get in contact? Many of the episodes in HLA Live will cover one or more of these important pillars. The HLA team consists of Pedra, Eamon, Tim, Riddy, Alistair, Adil and Trisha, and a range of other HLA scholars and faculty. In this episode of HLA Live, we are discussing continuing the momentum, widening participation after medical school, hosted by Jahangir Alom.
Hello everyone and welcome to the HLA Live session on widening participation in the postgraduate realm. Today I have 3 fantastic speakers on the panel and I'll introduce them one by one. My name is Jahangir Alom. I'm a F3 doctor studying public health at the London School of Hygiene. And I've done a fair bit of work around widening participation in the undergraduate realm. But today, my panelists will be talking about postgraduate widening participation. So to start off, I have Sonia Ike. She's a core surgical trainee in plastics and reconstruction in the KSS Deanery. She's a co-founder of Motivating Medics, a widening participation non-profit organisation focusing on undergraduate medical education. She's also a past scholar of the HLA in 2018 to 2019. She's a fellow at the Institute of Leadership and Management. And then I also have Enam Haque, a GP from Manchester, who's also a GP trainer, co-chair of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion group at the University of Manchester's Medical School. He's also the chair of the National Medical Schools Widening Participation Forum. Thank you so much, Enam, for joining us. And we also have Colin Melville, who's a honorary professor of medical education at the University of Manchester, Director of Medical Education at the General Medical Council, and a clinical intensivist as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Just to kick off, I will start by asking you, what unique challenges do you think widening participation doctors face at the beginning of their clinical training?
So I could answer that. So one of the big issues from an undergraduate perspective would be, feeling like, it's quite difficult sometimes to assimilate and actually, bond with your cohort at university. And then when you go on, post-graduation, this doesn't actually stop this feeling. So one would find that lots of activities, bonding activities, things to do to fit in, which usually involve finance, which involve, quite, I guess, the knowledge of certain activities, certain sports, etc. It may seem trivial, but actually post-graduation, if you want to get on with your colleagues and, have a good rapport with them for everyday work, if you struggle with this, then it can be a problem as well. So I think it's important to think about this in a very holistic way. It's not just the obvious academic factors, it's the bonding, the social aspects as well. Even the way one might talk, for example, whether your accent is more RP versus Cockney, for example, things of that nature, the schools that you went to, these issues do indeed crop up even post-graduation as well.
I agree totally with what Sonia's just detailed. The barriers are already there. What we've done as medical schools have been really successful in getting the students in with high percentages now compared to when I first started in widening participation many years ago into medical school. the Office for Students have realised that it's not just good to reduce the ratio of those from more wealthier backgrounds to those from less wealthy backgrounds in access, but student success is important and student progression. And from the evidence, it is all about networking. It's about what kind of research projects you get involved in, who you know, and the sort of issues of aspiration. I personally felt that when I was at medical school in the 90s, I did not feel I belonged there. I was in Sheffield, which was a great institute. I had a great time there, but I didn't feel like I belonged to the university. And I agree totally with what Sonia is saying, that this then follows into postgraduate, and that is a big challenge. And the other thing I just want to briefly mention is the issue of that transition from graduation to foundation programs. There's a massive disadvantage there, and I'm so glad Higher Education England are now doing sort of stakeholder discussions about this, because I think there is discussion about possible pre-allocation of students from WP backgrounds, and I think that is really would be helpful. Now, I've got a few more controversial suggestions that probably won't be taken on board, but I'd like to just mention it, if that's okay, Jingy.
Go for it.
It's not too controversial. It's to do with the scores. So the academic score that you need. So you have your situational judgment test score, 50%, but then you have 7 points, which is the academic score, which takes account of an intercalated degree, which is 5 points, and then published articles as well. And from discussion with students from WP backgrounds, a lot cannot do intercalated degrees because financially it's going to be difficult for them. And a lot can't get published because there's a lot of publications you need financial support, or you need to network with organizations. So in terms of the national forum and locally, we're working with student societies who want to widen participation in terms of research, in terms of academic profile, and it's amazing to see what our students are doing, and they're leading on that. And our National Student Working Group is one of those that's been key to that. So I think all I'm going to do is echo what Sonia said about the lack of role modeling, the lack of aspiration, but then there are some barriers, and it's that big leap from becoming a medical student to becoming a foundation year doctor, and you may not achieve as great in terms of the decile, in terms of your position, in terms of the deanery you choose, and in terms of the rotation that you end up in.
I think this is you cannot but acknowledge this is a really important issue. Credit to Medical Schools Council and medical schools for what they've sought to do to increase the number of applicants from so-called widening participation backgrounds. But one of the challenges we have is we don't have an agreed definition of widening participation. And whilst that doesn't matter for this conversation, it does matter when we're trying to look for evidential bases on which to make decisions. So I think we just have to keep that in the back of our minds. One of the things that I think has now been shown is that you can narrow the attainment gap through the course of undergraduate study. What we don't yet have is enough data to say, and what happens after that? So this is, I think, is a critical issue for us. And I think Sonia's already raised what I suspect are some of the many more important issues. It's not about your ability as a doctor. And of course, we're making lots of assumptions that your academic performance indicates your ability as a doctor. And we know that doctoring is much more broad than simply your ability to pass exams. And I think we need to be a little bit careful that we don't get sucked into something which is very easy to measure, but doesn't necessarily tell us whether doctors are good doctors. It's one part of I think, a more nuanced picture. Interestingly, though, if you look at the preparedness surveys, there isn't much difference between those of WP and non-WP background when it comes to their sense of preparedness to be an F1. So that suggests that this is more complicated than simply your ability to be a doctor. And I think both Sonia and Enam have touched on this already. And this is more likely to be the context in which you came into it, how like me you are, I mean, I wouldn't describe myself as coming from a WP background, but I was the first person ever in my family to become a doctor. So, you know, all of those explorations about things which are totally new, where you haven't got support and help and advice. You may come from a family, as others have said, where, you know, the financial constraints are more difficult, where your ability to move or travel is more difficult. So I suspect that we may find that these are more powerful influences of what happens in postgraduate than actually the ability to be a doctor, but perhaps we can come back to that.
So thank you, Colin. I think just touching on what you said about widening participation and defining it, the issue we have is it's a very dynamic definition. You know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the definition of widening participation was to get women into medicine. And and now we have more than 50% of our medical students who are women. And so to collect accurate data around the specific group that you're working on is difficult, because that group keeps shifting, you know, hopefully with the success of widening participation initiatives and strategies. I know everyone sort of touched on this, but we spoke about the issues that medical students or junior doctors who come from widening participation backgrounds face when they start their career. But Enam spoke about potential solutions with the points in their FPAS application process. But what other solutions do you think we may be able to implement, or what solutions are there to the issues that we've discussed?
So I would like to touch on, say, the professional support units that exist in each deanery, the PSUs as they're commonly called. You know, from my experience and to my knowledge, I don't think that there is a dedicated widening participation sector in these PSUs. And I think that that would be something, you know, to raise. A lot of WP students post-graduation sometimes don't necessarily like to highlight the fact that they come from widening participation backgrounds into medical school, as they feel that once again it may affect their assimilation and the way people perceive them, and indeed the perceptions of their ability to be a good doctor. And so I think that you know, trying to make it known that actually there's nothing to be ashamed of, and the help is there, and if you feel that you need it, then go for it, and it's available. So I think definitely the professional support units could do something about that. Also aspects such as finance, but then once again the finance and the pastoral care, once again this is in the professional support units. But I think that if there's a greater emphasis on you know, providing help for people who come from WP backgrounds, then this would be quite a good thing to start.
How have you found that in, you're a surgical trainee at the moment, and you know, surgery is known to have you know, expensive courses and expensive tick box exercises, should I say. How have you found that as a trainee who comes from a WP background? How have you found progressing through your career and navigating through surgical training?
It has been very interesting, I'd say. It has taken a lot of like self-awareness, a lot of reflection, and also, you know, taking the time out to also talk to more people and network, and, you know, try to understand people's, you know, perspectives. It's a two-way thing here. And so networking is definitely key. I think that I've always been quite a proactive person. So I was always the type of person who was reading up on person specifications, even as a medical student. And so to some degree, I always knew what was expected of me by the time I'd reached a point for entry. And I think that definitely helped. I did an F3, and I think that was phenomenal in that I was able to work back home in London. I trained in the East of England deanery for Foundation. So I went back to London, and by being in London, I felt that the networking hub was just there. So I was able to talk to people. I did quite well in my F3 jobs. And so consultants and registrars would then offer studies and research. And I think that, if anything, it just took a lot more proactiveness, as opposed to having kind of opportunities presented, or, you know. So I would say that was the challenge, because sometimes, you know, I found that I did burn out. And you don't want to say no to things because you feel that, oh, you know, this opportunity, I might not get it again. And I think that coming from a WP background, you always kind of have that in the background of your mind, you know, this opportunity is here, I have to take it. You kind of see it less as an option, but more as I have to do this. So I think it's a bit convoluted, but ultimately, it's quite multifactorial. There were many things I was thinking about, and I still indeed think about. I think in terms of the social aspects, once again, I'm first in the family. I was born and raised in Hackney, East London. I went to state schools throughout. I didn't see surgeons around me. And trying to prove to people that actually I want to do this and I have a genuine interest. But once again, that whole notion of trying to prove to people when actually I should just prove it to myself. So you can see how it's always there, but I would say it's getting better. And the more you kind of progress and you show that actually I can be here and I deserve to be here, and you've got the research and you're doing the things that everyone else is doing, it then becomes easier, I would say.
So I suppose what you're saying is once you've developed a foundation for your professional identity, then you can go on to do these things like networking and whatnot, and going on to speaking to people and senior doctors who want to involve you in research and studies and help you progress for your career. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's quite convoluted because I'm literally telling my own story. A bit all over the place, but essentially it is that, once you are able to prove yourself and you develop that kind of self-awareness and that confidence, ultimately, it makes things better. Yeah.
So I would totally agree again with what Sonia's saying. It's a good time at the moment to address this, because I think there's the NHS long-term plan, which wants to diversify the workforce so that there is representation. Because the evidence is, if there's representation of the community in the doctors that are serving it, then this is the time to do it. And that's been our evidence when we've been looking at it from a medical school perspective and our justification for it. In terms of solutions, it goes back to what seems to be quite successful in medical school, which is role modeling and mentoring, which Sonia is talking about, that whole issue. Are there people similar to me that I can look up to? Not like, let's say, for example, a surgeon that you can never relate to. But if you saw, let's say, for example, Sonia as a successful surgical trainee and very hopefully in the next few years, a fully fledged surgeon that has that power through through media, social media, through talks, just through representation, and to break down that stereotype that only a certain type of person can get into these ivory towers, these high positions of influence. And I think we are in a unique position, although we are not the ones that are in that comfortable place of diversity and representation. We have that opportunity for the next generation and the generations that follow to enable that path to come. So I think this is why I'm passionate about it, because we're in an exciting time, because at a national level, at a government level, people have acknowledged that whatever's happening is not working and it's not represented the UK, and we can actually influence change to make it better. Because it's, even if we've had that horrible experience, I had it in the 90s and in training and things like that, I've had lots of barriers there. But the thing that makes me happy and excited is that we can make that change.
Yeah, again, I think you've really touched on something, Enam. I mean, what's really interesting is that some of the things we're talking about here could so easily be paralleled across into some of the challenges of other groups, including, if I may mention, international medical graduates. And I think our challenge as a profession has always been that we expect other people to fit to our model. And actually, there isn't a one size fits all. It's not a profession where we're all the same. I mean, we see that in the diversification of character types that we kind of caricature that go into certain specialties, which perhaps we shouldn't talk about here. But there is something about how people coalesce around certain behaviours or personality types. But one thing that I think is clearly missing, and I've talked about this at previous education conferences, and I think both Sonia and Enam have touched on it, so it's worth reinforcing, is this whole thing of mentorship. We do an awful lot. So we have a structure that has an educational supervisor and a clinical supervisor. But who's interested in me? Who's there for me? Rather than saying whether I'm doing okay or not in terms of the curriculum or whatever. what about me in the context of the workplace in which I work? So I always, so I have two challenges. I say, you know, to everyone who's in that learning role, and that doesn't necessarily exclude people at the top of the career, by the way, find a mentor. You need a mentor. And for those of us who are privileged to be in very senior roles, look out for people that you can mentor. And that's about getting alongside them. It's about understanding things from their perspective and helping them to navigate their way through. It's not about saying, well, if you do it like I did, it'll be all right. So I think that's something we have not really captured. I remember some years ago, I was doing my master's in med ed at Nottingham University, and there was a chap there, I'm pretty sure his name is Gordon French, so apologies if it isn't, and I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning, but he was talking about developing a mentorship program. And at the time, and I was a consultant then, I didn't really latch onto it. Now it's probably the one thing I talk about more than anything else, and I actively seek to do with my own colleagues in the GMC. How can I help you? Or as Peter Homer says, and I have a huge amount of time for him, he says, when you appoint people, you should appoint people that are better than you, and you should help them to succeed even further. Now that to me is about mentorship. That's about saying, you know, it's not about me, it's about you. How can I help you? Now that's not peculiar to WP folk or to IMG folk. It's something we could all do. And actually, if we were actively engaged in it, who knows what could be unlocked and achieved through that process. So, you know, I absolutely agree with Enam and Sonia that mentorship is something we have not worked out the value of. Now, don't ask me how to research or test it. That's that's for a different day.
You think introducing mentorship into our training programs would be useful if you had, say, for example, your clinical or your educational supervisors, if there was an additional role for them to be able to mentor you? Do you think that would be too prescriptive, or would that be more effective? What do you guys think about that?
So can I go in first then, Jingy? So I think one of the big challenges here about mentorship is it has to be somebody that I can trust. And one of the problems we have, it's not that we don't trust education and clinical supervisors, but ultimately they have power and they can sign stuff off. The mentor doesn't do that. I remember many years ago when I was in Hull being asked to mentor a particular trainee who'd actually not trained in the UK. And I wasn't interested in how well they were doing. I was interested in helping them to work out how they could change things. And I think, so I don't think it means that as a supervisor, you can't be a mentor, but I think you have to work out that trust relationship, because mentorship is about trust. You have to trust me that what I'm going to say or how I can support and help you is something you can accept. Because if you can't, then it doesn't work, does it? So that for me is kind of quite an important element of the whole mentorship process. But it doesn't mean as a supervisor you can't also be a mentor. In fact, you know, maybe we should encourage some of those characteristics and attributes. The other thing is that sometimes mentors are better when they're outside of the environment in which you work, because they don't have a, I'm not sure what the right word is, I want to say premeditated, but they don't have assumptions about what's going on. So they ask more open questions, and therefore you have more open conversations.
I agree with what Colin's just said. We have a new program in Manchester. Colin might know about it. Is the Gold Mentor Scheme, and I think the way it works is that the mentee gets to request somebody. Okay, so they can request if they want somebody different to them, if they want somebody in the same faculty or in a different faculty, you know, if it's somebody quite junior in their academic career or somebody quite senior there. So it puts the onus on the mentee what they want out of it. So that might be a good way of not making it like, okay, so you're from a WP background, so we're going to give you a WP mentor, you know, or you're Bangladeshi, so you're going to get a Bangladeshi mentor. It puts the onus on that individual. If they feel that they will get the benefit from somebody who they can relate to, that's great. If they want somebody who they know has a lot of wise words and has got a massive international reputation, they get that chance to contact them as well. So I just wonder if what we're doing in Manchester, I know just as a small institute, well, it's a big institute, but one of many institutes, could be then looked into in postgraduate.
Yes, I would say I agree with both what Colin and Enam have both said. I would also like to add that the idea, I always talk about the distinction between mentorship, sponsoring and coaching. And I think that, you know, kind of just assigning people to be mentors from the get-go has its pros and cons. I think that mentoring has to come from it's an internal thing. You have to want to do it. And usually if you want to do it, you do a better job. But I think that there is nothing wrong with actually saying, actually, I may not be the best mentor, or I'm not in a position to really effectively mentor somebody, but I'm happy to sponsor you for this. So endorse you for something, you know, for some research, or coach you in this particular avenue, maybe provide some interview advice or, you know, coaching, etc. So I think that should be encouraged as well from a postgraduate standpoint. So it doesn't necessarily have to be mentoring per se. But recognizing that there are indeed other avenues that, you know, that somebody could help one in, and, you know, once again, that choice and that ability to be able to choose exactly what you feel that it is that you need definitely helps as well.
Yeah, and there's no, as Sonia I think is alluding to, there's nothing here that is a sort of permanent lifetime contract arrangement, is there? You know, someone might come and talk to me because they're particularly interested in an area that happens to be my expertise, and they might bring up something else, and I say, well, actually, I'm probably not the best person to help you here. Have you, you know, how do you feel about talking to so-and-so? And I always say to people, you know, I'm happy to help find a mentor, have a conversation with you, and then you have to decide between you whether that's going to work. It should feel very open. It should feel very supportive. It's not about, you know, if you don't click with the person, that's fine, actually. Let's find somebody else. But, you know, as you say, Sonia, the driver has to come from the person to want to be mentored. And then it is about finding the people that you can tap into. And I have no problem at all. I can think of 2 or 3 people where I gave them some pointers. They've gone off, and to be honest, I haven't seen them since. And that doesn't matter to me, as long as they can move on and find a successful pathway. And of course, it's not limited to WP graduates, but I do think we owe it to our colleagues to help everybody succeed, and that's what it's about.
Just a very quick thing. In medical school, there is this issue of lack of signposts. You know, people don't know who to connect with. And I think Colin's made a very important point there of that sort of signposting role, because I think it's that lack of knowledge, because we've concentrated so much on widening access, you know, getting into medical school, because we've said there's not enough knowledge there for aspiring medical students to apply properly there. So we've clocked that one, and it's with all these amazing initiatives like Sonia's and others that are dealing with that widening access issue. But then in student success, there are peer mentoring programs in medical schools that are trying to address it. But then in postgraduate, even if it was that signposting role, the linkages, and what I'm extending to a suggestion is providing resources that makes it an equal playing field, so that it doesn't become like an old boys network in terms of progression through foundation and specialist training, that everyone has equitable access to the information, because knowledge is power, isn't it, at the end of the day? And if you have that information, you've got a better way of progressing to whatever you want to aspire to. I
think, Sonia, you touched on something really important here, the difference between mentoring, sponsoring and coaching. You know, some of the barriers that Enam and Sonia initially mentioned, especially around, you know, additional research points, audits, quality improvement projects, and, you know, in training, clinics, procedures, if you're doing a craft specialty, having not only just a mentor but a sponsor who invites you to come to theatre, to scrub in for procedures, to come to clinic, to come to specialist clinics, and, you know, get involved with their research and audit is a lot more powerful than that individual will think when they you know, when they invite you along. They don't realize that they're breaking a barrier for you as an individual who's trying to navigate through this career with additional barriers. So I'm glad you brought that up, Sonia. That's really important to discuss. Colin and Enam, you mentioned at the very beginning about the data that we have in general practice in GP training about postgraduate widening participation. and I assumed you were talking about differential attainment when you were talking about that. Talk to me a little bit about the sort of differential attainment environment, the issues, and some of the solutions that you think we might have to overcome that, because I can imagine that applies to a lot more than just GP training.
So I actually have the data in front of me, Enam, but because I thought I ought to. But do you want to go first?
No, I'm happy for you to go first.
Okay, I just realised, you know, you being a GP, you probably had this, would know this as well. But let's so first off, let's just say that this is based on using gateway year access. So there are effectively, I think, 3 schools that provide a gateway access. That may be changing, but the data I have is for 3 schools. And that's cumulative data from 2013 to 2019. And what they did was they looked at the pass rate of those sitting the applied knowledge test of the GP exam and what the pass rates were. And in broad terms, I don't have the statistical analysis in front of me, but if you come from a standard or graduate entry, you have an 80+% chance of first time pass rate. If you come from a gateway, it is nearer to 60%. So there is clearly a difference in attainment. Now, differential attainment, of course, is a very significant area that we've been involved in for a number of years, and led by my colleague Jane Cannon. So it is broader perhaps than just the question of WP, because it impacts on other people, and there may well be crossovers between people who come through a WP pathway who also have other characteristics, including ethnicity, which may also predispose to those findings. When this all started a few years ago, the assumption was that it was the exam that was flawed. And I think we've moved on beyond that point. I'm not saying that that means we should be complacent about assessment, and it is something that the GMC is very interested in terms of impact assessment. Sorry, it's the same word, but anyway, impact assessment of how examinations perform. But we know that across a whole range of specialty exams, there is a differential attainment. We also know that it applies to other professions in the UK. And what's even more interesting is if you go to other countries, and I don't know how to express this. So in a piece that I was writing last night, I used the word non-native, but I don't mean that in any kind of pejorative way. So if you weren't born or brought up in a country, by origin or by ethnicity, you will face the same problem. So what's curious is it doesn't matter whether it's to the US, to the UK, to Canada, Australia. I think we've got data on all of those. The same issue arises. So there is something probably about cross-cultural boundaries. That may be one factor. And I suspect the other factor is about inclusion. That if as we can see, if you can narrow the attainment gap at medical school, what is then happening afterwards? Now, we tried to have a look at this week just to see if we'd got any data, but we don't have enough longitudinal data to say anything very confidently. I think that's our difficulty. And what is also interesting is if you look at, so I talked about preparedness earlier, so there doesn't appear to be any difference on a whole number of different ways of stratifying students in terms of their perceived sense of preparedness, in terms of the doctoring, which I think is interesting. But what's also interesting is that more WP students will go straight from F2 into specialty training, and more of them will choose general practice than non-WP. And also they're more likely to opt to train nearer to their, I'm going to call it home, and we define home as where they applied to medical school from. So their domicile at the time when they applied to medical school. So all of those things must have reasons for them. And as I think we alluded to right from the beginning, these are more likely to be societal and out of work reasons than probably in work reasons. So I think that's, that's just one thing that's worth bearing in mind in the data that we have. And as I say, the best data we've got is from general practice, partly because they were looking at it anyway. So we may be able to gain data elsewhere, but I would be surprised if it didn't show similar patterns.
Yeah, I completely agree with Colin there, and it echoes what Kath Wolf has found in her work with differential attainment, looking at the fact there's a lack of confidence, there is some bias there, relationships with supervisors, that sort of lack of inclusion into the community of practice. I think these are all key factors there. I'm not involved with the Royal College GPs, and I know they're doing lots of work. I am a member, so that's my contribution, is my financial support for them. But anecdotally, from working as a trainer in central Manchester, I do see these issues, and it is because subconsciously or consciously, I don't know how it is, that groups of trainees mingle in their own comfortable, similar groups, and that can potentially reinforce the barriers. And it's something that we've seen in medical school as well. Certain groups might orientate to a certain group, and the problem with that is that then the access to the links, the connections, the ways to actually get through the academic hurdles are lost. What I've also seen is that unfortunately, postgraduate, and again, this is me being controversial, postgraduate is very much a pass-fail, good-bad kind of field. And the problem is, I mean, there's a financial cost for failing. And if you're from a WP background, you don't have that kind of flexibility in terms of finances. So, and also it's that that feeling that you're not a good doctor for somebody who's already has poor self-esteem, possibly because it's never been told to them that they are worthy of being in this place. This reinforcement of failing, this reinforcement of having to pay extra cost to the Royal Colleges, I've seen that anecdotally have a negative impact, particularly on IMG doctors, but also doctors from ethnic minorities or who've got a widening participation background.
Yes, I'd just like to definitely echo what was just said by Enam, you know, that whole idea of not believing that you deserve to be here, and basically leading nicely onto imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is incredibly, is a problem. And if you don't deal with it very quickly and early on in your career, it can have disastrous consequences because you are constantly doubting yourself. And, you know, even with regards to postgraduate examinations, vivas, you've got to have this gift of the gab, but you've also got to be confident. You've got to believe that you deserve to be here, and you want to also, you know, aside from getting the actual examination content correct, you also want people to believe that you're saying the right thing as well. And if you, you know, have imposter syndrome, if you are constantly doubting yourself, you know, this can be a problem. I'd also like to say that I was looking at some studies, and I believe it was by Curtis and Smith earlier this year. They actually released a study, a longitudinal cohort study, looking at some medical schools. I think it included Southampton and I think King's College medical students. They looked at standard entry medical graduates versus gateway entry. And they found that with regards to the foundation application, so the prescribing safety assessment, the SJT, and the education performance measures, you know, standard entry pretty much did well. They did much better than gateway entry medical students and WP medical students. And so you can see from the get-go, you know, these are the assessments that are looked at that pretty much decide where you'll go for your foundation training. So right from the get-go, the differential attainment is an issue. And so I think that that needs to be looked into that bit more, and wondering why that's the case ultimately, because medical schools, you know, the average medical school course is 5 years. Some as short as 4, some as long as 6. And, you know, what is going wrong in these years whereby despite where you have started from, you're still not able to get to the same point. And that is what WP is meant to be about, getting everybody to the same point. And if that is still an issue, you know, right as you're leaving medical school, then something needs to be done about that.
Sonia, I'm absolutely delighted that you've referenced Curtis and Smith, because Smith is actually Daniel Smith, who is one of my team at the GMC. He actually worked on that piece. It's done at Southampton, as you rightly point out. And it was his work I was alluding to earlier when I said the attainment gap narrows at the end of medical school, but we don't have enough data yet to say what happens afterwards, because I mean there's a huge risk that it will then widen again for all the reasons we've just talked about, isn't it? But it's a good piece to get you know, as a basis on which to start thinking about, so what next? Yeah. Oh, he'll be delighted you read that.
Yes, I'm writing a paper on all of this, and that was one of my top reference points. I was so happy to see a longitudinal cohort study looking at all of that. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent.
And the other thing is, I'd like to mention Sally Curtis as well, who Jahangir knows very well. Yeah. I mean, she's like our role model, particularly looking at it from a national forum perspective in terms of the importance of student success and that sort of mentoring and support of students, and that study has clearly shown the benefits of offering that sort of support from right from foundation year when a student starts.
She'll be delighted that we spoke about her work in this forum. So do you think there's appetite now that, you know, Professor Curtis and Daniel's work have been published around the longitudinal data in the undergraduate realm? Is there data that needs to be looked at the moment, or are we still in a position where we don't have enough information in the postgraduate realm?
Can I offer one caveat, Jahangir? So your intention is absolutely right. I'm not doubting your intention. It's back to the point I made at the very beginning. So one of the things that Chris McManus has published more broadly is that those who are good at exams are good at exams. And those who perform better in A-levels then go on to get their postgraduate exams sooner and pass with higher levels. What I'm still kind of slightly challenging, maybe I can borrow a phrase from Enam, to be slightly controversial, is that the signal of a good doctor? Because if that's our measure, then I think we run the risk of missing out on a huge number of attributes that if you talk to patients, yes, they want someone who knows what they're doing, but they also want someone who is empathetic. They want someone who's got time for them, etc. So I think we just need to be a little bit cautious that we don't pin too much on that. I think what I would draw from Sally and Daniel's work is that if you come from a WP background, it does not mean that you maintain your academic gap. And I think that's a good thing. That's the plus. Given that we then said that if you look at the sense of preparedness, now of course that is a self-perception study, so I absolutely get that. If there isn't a difference, and we've looked at that through UK Med, you know, the UK Medical Education Database, on a number of parameters to say, you know, having said what I said about WP, not agreeing on what exactly we mean, or saying that there's lots of ways of describing it. If there is no difference on a number of parameters between their sense of preparedness, then something else is going on. And I guess the question is, what is the something else that means that we perceive a difference in what you might call academic attainment? What does that mean? And in the broader differential attainment field, what we are, I think, concluding is that this has to do with the culture in which we learn and work. Not so that, so your exam, if you like, is the end point of a series of other events in which you then do a test, which, as Enam quite rightly points out, is binary. You either pass or you fail, even though it has a range of marks attributed. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful. I'm not saying we shouldn't look at it. It is one marker. I think it's more about, we might look more about progression in general, but of course that is also predicated heavily on assessment, and just satisfaction probably, and their sense of value within the profession may be more useful. I'm just kind of thinking about how we take this forward without attaching ourselves to a singular value that we're using to find a solution.
No, absolutely, Colin. I'm glad you clarified that on my behalf. I think it's interesting to look at when you talk about what you define as a good doctor, and I think every doctor has a different definition themselves. And quite often, you know, we'll look at ARCP, different aspects of our ARCP criteria in different specialties. Have I done enough to pass? If passing is what I measure as a success. One thing I learned very early on in my FY1 year was patients don't care about what you know. Everyone's passed finals and has become a doctor here. Patients care about you being compassionate, you being caring. That's what they worry about. And I think as individual doctors, we think less about that, and we focus more on, am I doing enough academically? Am I doing enough in terms of getting everything that I need to do to progress onto the next part of my career? And that largely focuses on ARCP and the requirements for ARCP. So yeah, you're right. Exams are just one aspect, but there are other barriers.
And potentially we've created a more competitive environment in postgraduate medicine perhaps than is the case in undergraduate. I mean, it's there, but I think there is, having been ahead of 3 schools, the focus is on everyone's in it to get through. I know we have awards for the best person for this or that, but there's less competition. Whereas once you start to look at foundation and above, everything is competitive. If I have a better CV, if I've got more stuff that I've done, if I got better marks in exams, I get better choice at the job I choose. And so we're not so collegiate at that point. Now, I don't know whether we can break that cycle, by the way. Maybe it's a sort of almost Darwinian type natural selection, but it's a shame because it does mean that we have this situation where those who come at the bottom of a norm reference system end up in the jobs that nobody else wants. And one obvious thing for me is if you're in a job you didn't want to do, the likelihood of you being happy at the end of it is lower than if you're in the job you wanted to do. So when we looked at F1, I think Fiona Patterson found some years ago that there was a good correlation between the SJT and the outcome at the end of F1, and justified that SJT was therefore a good tool, whereas my view is slightly different. It is simply that if you get higher up, you get the job you want and you're more likely to be satisfied. Whereas if you've got the job furthest away from where you lived and trained, in a place which perhaps doesn't have such a good reputation, and you have an unhappy period, then perhaps you're not going to do as well. So to me, it's not entirely surprising. And if we then extrapolate, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that WP students may fall into that bracket, and then you can start to see why things seem less happy, less successful, less attainment, etc. That sounds a bit apocalyptic. Sorry, it wasn't meant to be like that. But it just to focus on how we need to think, I suppose, and how can we change this to be a bit more collegiate and support one another rather than fighting each other over the scraps.
I would probably like to see, what you mentioned, Colin, about those other qualities of doctors to be a part of the assessment. So as an ST trained in general practice, we have our capabilities that we look at, but they are quite hard capabilities. I understand you need that to prove that you are qualified to become a GP, but there's lots of qualities I see in my trainees. It sometimes comes out in the the patient satisfaction questionnaire or the multi-source feedbacks and things like that, but a lot of it is that sort of that hidden entity, the hidden curriculum side of things, which I know that trainee will be amazing, but I can't capture it. So it's whether or not there can be a more holistic assessment done. And I'm not just talking about postgraduate. I think undergraduate probably needs to have a more holistic assessment as well, because the rewards all go to the academically bright, not the socially conscious. Because there are there are many people that do things outside their core work, not for the purpose of their career. They do it because they're just a decent human being who wants to change their society. And I'd like to just go back to the idea of the doctor in the first place, which was not only to help the patient in front of them, but to help their entire community and to make a community difference as well. And that is the ancient principle of being a doctor to make that not for their own career progression and to be celebrated, but to actually be the person that everyone can trust in that locality, whether in the hospital or in primary care. So I would love to see a holistic approach to both undergraduate and postgraduate.
Yes, I'd like to say I definitely agree with what both Colin and Enam has said. I think it's quite a tricky one in that using academic factors is just a lot easier because it's a lot more binary and it's a more, quantitative assessment, and you can either, in terms of choosing who you're, kind of shortlisting, etc. It's just easier to go on scores. But actually, I agree, the way in which we are picking people in specialty training, for example, should be a lot more holistic. I use an example because this is what I'm going for. So something like plastic surgery. Plastic surgery, there are only a few numbers in the country. It's very competitive. You need to have written a book, for example, to score the highest score in the teaching section of the application. Lots and lots of studies, lots and lots of presentations. But actually, I'm finding that as the months go by, and I'm currently in my plastics job, you have to be very holistic with the way in which you approach patients. So, for example, there are lots of psychosocial elements, socio-economic factors with regards to patients who are more likely to have burns, for example, and actually looking at these things. And I don't think that, not to say that if you're brilliantly academically gifted, you can't look at things in a holistic manner, but I think that sometimes that is ignored. And I think plastics in particular, which is why I'm falling in love with it more and more every day, is actually the psychosocial aspects are vast. And I don't think people realize that, even from the, say, aesthetic side of things, the psychological elements and why people want to be, how they want to be and why they want to look how they want to look, and the factors that come into that. So I think that if we focus so much on the academics, that is ignored. And actually, to be quite good at the job, you need to be able to look at things, from a bigger, larger perspective. And so I think perhaps from the interviews, there needs to be a section on how did this person come across? I guess you can fake it, but can you really fake it, to be honest? I don't think so. So that would be something to look at, I'd say. Yeah.
I'm very conscious of time. I know this started off as a discussion and ended up as a conversation between us. Was there anything anyone else wanted to add around postgraduate widening participation, or any thoughts they had, or anything that they wanted to mention before this and didn't have an opportunity?
I'm just so happy that the discussion is taking place, because we've talked a lot, as I've said, about widening access, and we're looking at medical school, but postgraduate is another key area. So I'm glad widening participation isn't ended the whole conversation once someone graduates and there's an assumption made that it's all equal now because now you've all got money, that you've overcome all the barriers and life is great. We need to make our medical students aware of the challenges that comes out from foundation and specialist training, and we need to work together as those in positions of influence to make that change.
And I'd just add one thing to what Enam has said. I think there is a risk, as there is with so many things, by the way, that we talk about it, we don't take actions. So I think my plea would be to those who are, tuned into this, that we go from it thinking about what can I practically do to help make the change, rather than get caught up in, well, this is too difficult, which is, I think, sometimes how it feels. It's in the too difficult pile. So we'll put it on one side, and maybe at some point we'll come back to it because there's lots of other things we can do. We have to change this across the whole sphere of issues that affect differential attainment, and it is a focus for the GMC, and it is a focus that I think we as a profession can own to change, and I hope our HLA colleagues will see that as an opportunity to influence change in a really positive way.
Yes, and I'd like to say, I guess, to add as a final note to WP students who've gone on to become doctors like myself, I guess I'd like to say, just don't give up, and you will get there, and it does get better. And try to eliminate the imposter syndrome. You deserve to be here, and keep that in your mind. I always say, there's two things I always say when I give my motivated medics workshops, and it's that one, representation matters. Okay, so when you go out there and you talk to these young, 14, 15-year-olds, and they actually look at you and say, oh my gosh, you made it. I can do this as well. That is incredibly powerful. And also fundamentally, you cannot be who you cannot see. And so if, young people are looking and not seeing people who, are of similar backgrounds to them, working class backgrounds as well, state schools, etc., they feel like this dream is impossible, and it's important to try and dispel those myths. And so I would say, to WP undergraduate students, we are doing everything we can currently to make sure that your experience is better as a postgrad, but don't give up, ultimately, as cliche as that sounds.
I think you wrapped that up very nicely for us, Sonia. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Colin, Enam, Sonia, thank you very much for joining us for this HLA Live session.
Thank you to everyone that made tonight's episode possible. Whenever our scholars are thinking about complex problems facing our health systems, we encourage them to think about how they make significant change in the world of healthcare. We are incredibly lucky to have some incredible scholars in the HLA. They use the HLA as a platform to take their ideas and bring them to fruition. If you are interested in the work of the HLA, why not join us at one of our future HLA events? Why not join one of our programs? Why not even become a HLA scholar? Thank you for joining us. My name is Johan Marlwana, the Director of the HLA, and it's a good night from all of us.
I can develop as a leader of the team that I'm already involved in with MediSense, but also pick up extra skills that will make me more effective in leading medical clinical teams in the future.